The first time I went to Antarctica, I was just totally hooked. Everywhere I looked, I could see a testable hypothesis that was just like, it was like neon lights flashing saying, here's a question that no one can answer anywhere in the world, but you can answer it here. And so for me, it was massive brain candy.
Welcome to the Why Magazine podcast, bringing you ideas, stories, and voices from Brigham Young University. I'm Whitney Singley Archibald, and today I'm so excited to introduce you to Byron Adams, a beloved and intrepid biology professor at BYU whose natural curiosity has led him from the woods of his childhood to the ocean floor, he's an avid scuba diver, to the barren valleys of Antarctica, where he lives for 2 to 3 months of every year, and of course to his lab, where he explores at a more microscopic level. His passion for microfauna, tiny creatures like tardigrades and nematodes, is so contagious that a former student even named a new species of nematode after him. In our conversation with Byron Adams today, we're going to talk about some of his research, explore the role of curiosity and wonder in his work, and talk about how we can cultivate curiosity in our own lives and discover our own superpowers. You'll be able to read more about Adams and his work in a feature article in the spring issue of Why Magazine, written by Brittany Karford Rogers. If you have a minute, we'd love to hear what you think about the Why Magazine podcast. What episodes have you enjoyed? What or who would you like to learn about in a future episode? Let us know by clicking on the link in the show notes to take our listener survey. I started my conversation with Byron Adams by asking him how he first became interested in learning about the natural world. Turns out he was a bit of a handful in his early years.
I had ADHD really big time, right? And I was completely uncontrollable. My dad would come home and find me on the roof of the house. I'm only 4 years old. I was always throwing dirt clods in the neighbor's pool. I was completely uncontrollable. And my dad just said, let's just figure out how to channel that energy into something positive. And so we bought a house which was on the edge of wilderness, so it was a neighborhood with a bunch of neighborhood kids, but the backyard literally went up to the mountains. And so I was able to grow up, somewhat feral with
free-range kid, right?
Right, free-range kids. And so there was streams and trees and snakes and gophers and, we climbed the trees and we chased the animals. It was just a idyllic childhood. And then, when I was about 10 years old, we moved to a farm. And it also allowed me to just be completely immersed in the natural world and to see things that most kids don't get to see, like cows have calves, right? And cats have kittens, and, how plants go from seeds to things that you eat. I just felt really lucky all the way through high school. And so I always knew that I was going to be a biologist, but I didn't know that there was such a thing as a biologist. So the only people in my town who had studied biology were doctors and dentists and things like that. And so I thought, well, if I like biology, I have to be a doctor or a dentist. And that didn't change until I was like a junior in college when I finally realized, I remember asking a question of a professor in class, just in the cell biology class. And I loved the class. It was an amazing class. And I asked the question, the professor was like, well, we haven't really figured that out. We don't know yet. And in my mind, I was like, well, if I just had some DNA and I could figure this out. And he said, yeah, you could. That would be how you'd answer that question. I remember thinking, I could do this, But biology was still really hard for me. Like the classes were really challenging. Yeah. Like I was getting not great grades in those classes. But philosophy and English came a lot easier to me. And so I minored in philosophy and English to get my GPA up. And then I still majored in zoology. I felt like I really had a really well-rounded education when I left BYU and went off to grad school. I had a lot of tools in my toolbox that my cohort, the other graduate students, just did not have. They didn't have that broad foundational educational experience that I got at BYU, which was just phenomenal.
That's awesome. And, like you said, those aren't fields of study that people often put together. But how do you think they do complement each other?
Oh, man, English and philosophy in so many ways, because you have to be able to really think critically. You have to be able to deconstruct things and put them back together. And you also have to be creative. And science is creativity. Science is coming up with a clever question and then coming up with an even clever way to answer that question. And so the process of how we think about things, and particularly how you articulate your ideas, like how I would write, was very strongly influenced by my background in English and philosophy at BYU, such that it was almost like an unfair advantage to the other students, compared to the other students, because I could already do all of these things that they were trying to learn for the first time. I had already done that. And I'd also done research as an undergraduate student here at BYU, which was also really novel at the time. Like most places, undergraduates didn't do research. And I'd kind of run my own research program and written grant proposals and things like that. So when I got to graduate school, I'd already done most of the things that the other students were just starting to learn about.
And was that kind of on your own initiative that you did the research, or was everybody in your program doing that?
Yeah, it was kind of a little bit on my own initiative. Like I loved scuba diving growing up. I wanted to be a marine biologist. I wanted to study marine ecology and marine biology. And I took a marine biology class, and I did okay in the class, but not great. But the professor in the spring would take students out to Hopkins Marine Station and like for the whole spring semester, just really study marine biology, larval ecology, intertidal ecology, all kinds of really cool stuff.
Right.
And I really wanted to be in this class. But he could only take 8 students or something like that. So I applied to go, but the professor was like, yeah, I can only take 8 students and your grades aren't that great, So I didn't make the cut, right? And then about 4 weeks before he was going to go down there, he saw me in the hallways. He said, hey, Byron, come here. Hey, you're a diver, right? And I was like, yeah, I got a lot of diving. And so he's like, you could come be in the class. You could be the research diver. And so I was able to do that the first time, and I loved it. And I think I did well enough. He invited me back the next 2 years to be TA for the class. And so that's really how I got my hooks into research, like how to do research, how to ask questions.
I would love to go into some of this field research. First of all, I just want to know, what did you think the first time you went to Antarctica?
The first time I went to Antarctica was like, I was just totally hooked. Like I'd read about it. I'd read the scientific papers. I'd talked to my colleagues who had been there before. And there's just no describe. I'd seen photographs, figures, videos. But then once I actually had boots down on the continent in the ecosystems where I was going to study, it just totally blew me away, because like everywhere I looked, I could see a testable hypothesis that was just like, it was like neon lights flashing saying, here's a question that no one can answer anywhere in the world, but you can answer it here. Right? Because of the way Mother Nature has done a whole series of really cool experiments down there. I just show up, collect the data, interpret them, and answer the question. And so for me, it was massive brain candy. And then the colleagues that I was there with were these incredibly brilliant scientists, like the very best of the best on the planet are down there. And so like the ideas going back and forth, and the arguments and the different viewpoints, because we come from very different disciplines, was just amazing too. So those things just totally opened up my mind, opened my eyes to new ways of seeing the world, new ways of doing science, thinking about science. I think up until then, I'd always thought like just really small in terms of science and what's possible. And then after being down there, I was like, no, like you can do big science, like really, really big science with big teams and with brilliant people, and ask really hard questions that are highly relevant, like really important questions.
So how on earth do you decide from all those ideas, all those hypotheses that you're seeing out there, how do you figure out what it is that you want to study down there?
I think I tend to prioritize them by like how big the idea is, how important the idea is, how transformative is this going to be, like how hard is this to do in other systems, and how big of a contribution is it going to make to the overall body of science. And then I tend to prioritize those. And very few of those are just my ideas alone. Like those are big ideas that require, my graduate students and my colleagues and their students to kind of put all of our data together to answer questions that are that big.
So what are some of your favorite projects that you've worked on then?
Well, my favorite project, the one that I'm most proud of, and the one that I think is the most important, is one it just came out, a couple of years ago, but I think a lot of people just kind of don't get it yet, right? They don't get like how cool it is. This is really funny. Like sometimes I'll write a paper and I'll think, this is kind of ho-hum. And then the world just blows up with it. And they're like, oh, this is the greatest thing ever. And I'm like, that was all right. And then other times you'll have a project that you like, I just know this is going to change the world. And then your colleagues read it and they're like, I'm not sure I quite get this, or I'm not seeing the connection or whatever. And you're like, what? So the paper that I'm most proud of, the project that I'm most proud of, took about 10 years or more to bring it all together. And this was a series of experiments that show that phosphorus as an element, so it's really important. It forms the backbone of your DNA and your RNA, right? And it's really critical, important for growth and development of an organism. And in Antarctica, we have a system where in one valley, it's really low in phosphorus, and in another valley, it's really high in phosphorus. And they're only, like a few kilometers apart. So populations of the same species that live in those two valley systems, it turns out they should evolve differently in response to how much phosphorus is there. So in the areas where there's very little phosphorus, you can make predictions about how they should grow a lot slower. They should have to reach a larger body size before they mature. They should prolong their reproductive effort in order to have equivalent numbers of babies, right? And that they probably have less elemental phosphorus in their bodies and a whole bunch of other things. Anyway, I had a student, my first PhD student, I said, well, let's collect some animals from both of these areas and just check them, measure them, see how much phosphorus is in them and that sort of thing. And that the data came back that totally fit the evolutionary predictions, like to a T. And I was like, that is too good. That can't be right. That is, these populations, they're so close to each other. There's no way this could be true. And so then I decided, well, if it really does work that way, then we should be able to produce them in the laboratory. So we should just do an evolution experiment in the laboratory and grow them on high or low phosphorus and see if they achieve the same things. And so you can imagine that takes a long time, right? To just grow these for many, many generations. But in the end, it turns out that they did. We were able to reproduce the same things that happened to them in their natural system. We were able to reproduce in the laboratory. So I was really proud of that work because I figured that one paper really told the whole story really nicely. And so I'm really proud of that paper.
That is so interesting. And how many students are we talking? How many actually get to go down to Antarctica with you?
So that's the hardest thing, is to get a human in Antarctica is actually the biggest challenge. Like when I write a grant proposal, like I just check a box. Yeah, I need a Hercules aircraft and helicopters and pilots and mountaineers, and I need this many tents and this many snow machines. But if I say I'd like to bring one undergraduate with me, they're like, whoa, like you're allocated this many people. That's all, And so when you write a grant proposal, they look really hard at the number of people that are going to deploy to the field. And typically, it's like, well, we're taking a team to the NBA finals. Like, who do you want on your team? And so it's like, we got like 5 number 1 draft picks, and you want to pick like the very best role players for each position that you need them to be on your team. And so I remember the first year when I brought an undergrad down on my team, like my colleagues were like, wait, what? Like you could have drafted Kobe Bryant for this position, right? And you brought like an undergrad. And I was like, yeah, but my undergrad's awesome. Like I can train him before he comes down. He can do all the stuff that we want to do. And I think they were skeptical until that first undergrad came down and was totally awesome. And then they were like, oh yeah, Byron's got this. He's got this figured out, And so after that, they never questioned any of my choices for personnel on the team.
That's an amazing opportunity. That is so cool. So let's talk about, instead of the big elephant in the room, the tiny nematode in the room, this nematode that was named after you.
Yeah, sure. So I have a former undergraduate student, Adler Dillman, and when he was in our laboratory, we worked really like our study system revolved around using these worms that are parasites and pathogens of insects, and they live in the soil, and they have these really cool life history traits, about how they, their modes of reproduction and how they kill insects with endosymbiotic bacteria. And it's just a really, really fun, cool system. And even some of them, the bacteria glow in the dark. And so the dead insects glow in the dark. There's all kinds of really neat stuff associated with these worms. And so I had these systems that we were studying in our lab, and Adler was an incredibly brilliant undergraduate student, but he started working with these worms in my lab and started his own research program at the University of California at Riverside, and started doing bigger and cooler science than anything we were doing in my lab. And then Adler needed some worms that had already been described from Thailand, and so he just had his colleagues, hey, can you collect some of these and send them to me? And when Adler was looking what he got sent to him, he was like, these aren't the worms I asked for. In fact, these worms look like a totally new species. Like no one's described these things before. And so Adler did the hard work to describe the species as a new species. And then he named the species after me, which was really an honor. And people have said, oh, isn't that great to have a worm named after you? And I'd be like, well, that's not what really makes it great, right? Like a lot of people have weird stuff named after them. The big honor for me is that Adler would choose to name it after me, right?
That is so cool. And what is the name?
Steinernema Adamsi is the name of the worm.
Nice. Love it. So why nematodes and all the other microscopic things that you study? Why are these so fascinating to you?
For me, they're fascinating because it's like the constraints on their use in the laboratory is very limited. And the time that they've had on planet Earth to explore all kinds of different, adaptive strategies is also amazing. And so for me, they're sort of like, like lab rats or mice that you can study, except that no one cares if you squish them and extract their DNA, or if you freeze them, or if you light them on fire, or you burn them, or you dry them to a crisp. So we can study really cool basic mechanisms of survival. We can study population genetics. We can study the evolution of all kinds of cool traits that they have. And we can do it pretty quickly. They have a really fast life cycle. But at the same time, they're animals just like you and I. I mean, they're animals with a nervous system and a reproductive system and a digestive system. Like they have all the parts, and they have the genes for all the parts. And a lot of the genes that they have are the same ones that we have even. And so we have an animal model that we can study that can answer a lot of really cool questions for us pretty quickly. But then as applied to ecology, I also think that they're really cool because they play such an important role in sustaining life on Earth. These animals, are the most abundant animal on the planet. They're involved in important functions, cleaning our water and providing fertile soils and things like that, cycling nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. And so they play such a critical role in sustaining life on the planet that as a whole, as a group, they're also really fascinating to study.
Very cool. So I'd love to kind of go to a more general place and talk about any advice you have about how to cultivate curiosity in any field you're pursuing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that all people, especially kids, are just naturally curious. And so anything that we can do to nurture that curiosity is going to pay off big time later on. Like I just have too many students in my classes where it just seems like the world has beat that curiosity out of them.
Yeah.
It's like you don't study something because you're curious. You study something because you want to get a job and make a bunch of money, right? Yeah. And so I think that anything we can do to just help anybody, not just young people, right? But people my age even, to just say, hey, like, look how beautiful this is, or look at how weird this thing is, or look at how colorful it is. How did it get that way? Why is it that way? Anything that we can do that makes a space for people to engage in the world like that is going to help that creativity in them. And then just moving forward with that curiosity as if it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what people think you're weird for, collecting earthworms and whatever it is, right? Like we all have a innate curiosity that we have as children. And I think if you just don't grow up, right, if we could just help people not to lose that as they age, then they'd be better positioned to be better everything, right? You're going to be a better scientist, but you're going to be a better thinker. You're going to be a better voter. You're going to be a better citizen, right? You're going to be a better neighbor if you're still curious, if you're still motivated by curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you do in your classroom to spark this with your students?
Well, I think one thing I do is try and show my own vulnerability, right? Like show everybody that like I'm okay with being a weird dude who's curious, but I'm also okay with embracing those aspects of the natural world that give me tremendous meaning, right? The things that I see and experience in the natural world that I find awe-inspiring and moving and beautiful. I'm sure they connect with those, right? And if I can just nurture that connection, when's the last time you felt this way? And so I try and use my own experience and show them that, hey, I might not be that much of an outlier, and show them how that curiosity infuses and motivates the research that I do. You show me an awesome, successful scientist, and I'll show you someone who still thinks like a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. I look at my own childhood and I see how that, helped me to become the person that I am, the way that my parents raised me, right? By saying, hey, this kid's, different, but we're going to figure out how to channel that energy into something that's positive. We're going to help him learn how to compensate for the things that might be hangups and then channel that into things that could be essentially my superpowers, right? So I think of the superpowers that I have. Many other parents would think of their child as being like messed up, right? If you have those particular traits. And my parents were able to say, hey, those aren't deficits. Those are superpowers that just need to be channeled. And I see that on my own kids, and I see that in the students that I have in the classrooms too. They'll come to me saying, oh, I got a challenge with this or a challenge with that. And I'm like, yeah, you got superpowers. You just need to learn how to harness, and that changes the way that they think about themselves as individuals, but also they are more actively engaged in solving problems with the tools and skill sets that they have, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, another thing I'd love to talk to you about is you definitely have a front row seat to our Heavenly Father's creations. How has learning about all these amazing creatures, amazing places, amazing systems, how has that affected your own understanding of spiritual things?
Oh, I definitely have a front row seat to things that are really special. Like, as a scientist, I'm the first person that's seen a particular worm, maybe the new species, right? I'm the first person to understand how some kind of a scientific process produces a pattern that we see in the world, right? And I get to be the person that introduces that to the world. It's like, here's a revelation, here's some knowledge that was generated, and now I'm sharing it with everybody on the planet. I think that's a special thing, that I get to do that I don't take for granted. I don't take for granted that I might be the first person to ever set foot in a certain place in Antarctica or to ever see a particular feature or an organism. And because I take that very seriously, I also take it seriously that I need to share that with other people. And I think that I'm making contributions that are significant to pressing problems that humans need to address. And I feel prompted to do those sorts of things. We learn that revelation comes in many different ways. It comes through our prophets and apostles, and it also comes through our laboratories and our scientific observations. And I feel really lucky. Like, I'm not saying I'm some kind of prophet, right? But I feel like, in a way, I'm receiving revelation and I'm making it available to the world, right? Like, here's some important stuff for our world to know right now, and then I share it with the world. And I feel incredibly lucky that that's my role as a scientist and as a professor at BYU.
That was such a fun conversation. I love that glimpse into such a different world. If you want to learn more about Byron Adams and his research, we've included links to 2 videos about his work and another video of a TED Talk he gave at TEDx BYU in 2022, entitled How Antarctic Animals Give Us Hope. And you'll also be able to read more about him in the spring 2024 issue of Y Magazine, arriving in April. Special thanks to Brittany Karford Rogers for writing that article. You can look for new episodes of the Y Magazine podcast on the first and third Thursday of each month, wherever you listen to podcasts and on YouTube. The Y Magazine podcast is produced by me, Whitney Archibald, with executive producer Peter Gardner. Original music, mixing, and mastering by Jarrett Davis.